Let's start with a word of prayer. Let's pray. God, we're thankful for each and every day. We are thankful for this time and place to break bread in your house together as strangers and friends, as strangers who become friends. And we are thankful for Cynthia and Sheila and the way that they feed us, both with their love and their food. As we segue into our understanding of Russia and Ukraine today, we thank you that Dr. Banks is with us, and we would ask that you would be with those who are the most vulnerable, those who are suffering, those who are displaced, those who are dying as we speak in the streets in such terrible and horrible fashion. Lord, help us to know how we can respond and help those in need. And let this day be one of learning so that we can continue to grow as a part of the human family and your larger family. So bless us in this time. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so don't want to keep us waiting. I want to introduce Edith Tabor, who's going to introduce Dr. Banks to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm the elder, an elder at the church here, and on the Christian Education Committee. And so we are the group that brings you these kind of events. And so welcome to the inaugural Lunch and Learn event. And really hope this is the first of many to come. I think this has been a pretty good start. Really appreciate Dr. Banks being willing to come on pretty short notice. But the topic is so timely, and so really wanted to start with one that would be meaningful to everyone. So let me go ahead and introduce him. He has quite a lengthy bio on the Columbus State website, which you can read more about. I'll just mention some highlights. He is the Assistant Professor of History at the Department of History and Geography at CSU, and the Assistant Director of Experiential Learning and Career Design Center, the executive editor of Age of Revolutions. He got his undergraduate at Georgia State University and his master's and doctorate at Florida State University. He is a specialist in 18th century French history, especially the Huguenots, and I understand he'll be traveling back to the south of France. Probably this is not his first trip, to this summer, to continue his research. I'd love to see some of his pictures and hear some more about that, wouldn't y'all? Maybe he'll come back again and talk to us soon, if we're nice to him. So he is historian of modern Europe whose research interests explore the intersections of religion and revolution, and he recently co-authored a piece on religion and revolution for the Oxford Handbook on Religion and Europe. So let's warmly welcome Dr. Banks without any further ado.
So I have the microphone on. Everybody can hear me okay, yes? So I insist that students call me Dr. Banks because for a while there I looked so young. I think the grays are starting to come in and the students would mistake me as one of their own, and so I demanded some respect, I suppose. But in this setting in particular, just call me Bryan. This is very much my teaching philosophy, that I like to learn with the students as much as I want to be the proverbial sage on the stage of sorts. So I've got some fun things to talk about with you all today. What's happening in Europe is obviously a crisis, and if you're like me, you've been watching the news, you've probably been glued to it maybe a little too much and need to distance yourself from it on some level, or at least find a way to process that, right? What I always tell students is perhaps one of the best ways to process moments of crises is to stop, try to understand where that crisis came from, understand that it's always more complicated than perhaps the news media or your relatives want to tell you it is. And then from there, choose a path forward, right? And so I'm going to give you my spiel about where I think this Ukrainian crisis came from, and then I'm going to do the very uncomfortable thing for a historian, especially one of the 18th century, which is offer what little predictions I feel comfortable making. And then I'm hoping that my predictions will then become a vehicle for our Q&A or maybe some open discussion, because I'm sure that many of you have insights that I have not considered yet too, right? So just as I do with the students in the classroom, I hope to learn from you as much as I hope to inform as well. So when I put my PowerPoint together, the original draft had all of these torrid images, these terrible things that are happening in the Ukraine as a way to really humanize the suffering of these individuals. And then I remembered that lunch was happening right before it. So I didn't do that. I took it off. I left it a pretty nice anodyne white and black background with a very generic title. But I do want to take a moment just to remember that there are people suffering in this situation, and that suffering is deeply personal. Right? I'm assuming that advanced. It did. Awesome technology, guys. It's wildly personal, and it's going to leave a mark on the people's lives who are experiencing this for the remainder of their lives, if not for generations to come. All it takes is what are we at now? 3 weeks for this kind of impact to land on these individuals. And so you see this image of a Ukrainian couple getting married at a territorial defense unit base inside a hospital, right, with a chaplain and combat paramedic. I find this image really beautiful and hopeful in a lot of ways, that two people decided to take a union with each other amidst a war, gave them hope, gave them comfort as they then went out into the streets and had to defend for their lives. So it's personal. History is always personal. Even if we're going to zoom out to the macro level here in just a minute, we have to remember that these are human beings living through an experience that we can't really fathom, perhaps, in Columbus, Georgia, thousands of miles away. Here's another image of an elderly woman. I imagine her walking home with her groceries in front of a residential building that's been hit by a Russian bomb. A reminder that even if this conflict ends in the next week or 2 weeks, or who said 45 days, right? These people are going to be living with the consequences of these actions for the foreseeable future. And once the conflict comes to a close, it's going to be very tempting for us to forget. If not forget, to move on to the next crisis, and so on and so forth. Because again, we're not having to live with this landscape in our backyards like they will have to. And then perhaps one of the most dramatic of all of these is the sheer demographic shift that Ukraine is going to see in the not so distant future. 2.6 million people as of Monday, when I put this statistic on the slide, have since left the Ukraine. We've been hearing reports of people sneaking back across the border to try to reclaim their property, to better secure it in moments of downturn, but those numbers are likely to increase. 2.6 million is a lot of people in a country that numbered about 44 million people prior to the invasion on February 24th. So somebody who's not a historian and much better at math would tell you pretty quickly, right? That's what, 5%-ish of their population. That's considerable. And then you have to think about who are these people who are actually fleeing? Who can leave and who is allowed to leave are two different questions, right? Who can leave means that people that aren't handicapped, who have the financial resources to leave their homes, those are the people who are getting on these trains and heading to Poland, okay? Who's allowed to leave is the other question. Men of a certain age aren't allowed to leave because they're there to fight in these makeshift militias. And so you see this train image mostly occupied by women and children. The gender demographic shift of the future of the Ukraine is going to provide some very interesting and perhaps unique challenges. Okay, so I started with the personal. We started with that I think heartwarming image on some level of this couple trying to find hope amidst the darkness. We zoomed out to the infrastructural, to the architectural, and now we've zoomed out to the demographic, right? So what I want to do then is break this all down into 3 basic topics. Graham's not in here, but maybe some of you know Graham. Graham's one of my students, and my students know that I love the number 3 more than anything else. I make them do this really childish childish thing where they wiggle their fingers and we say it's magical. And that's because psychologists have shown that human beings process critical think best when we're presented with things that come in threes. It's not a dialectic or a binary. It's not a black and white. It's not two factors, but you add a third and all of a sudden the human brain is capable of processing information at a different speed, a different level. So the three things that I want to talk about are these three things. My subtitle, I suppose, up here on the slide, what I'm calling the battleground of history, right? History is political in a very real way, and there are multiple parties who are contending for a vision of history here that asserts their political agendas, all right? We want to talk about the geopolitical elements of all of this as well as the economic concerns. We cannot hope to understand why Putin decided to invade without considering these three things, I think. That's what I'm telling you all, and you feel free to push back as much as you would like, okay? I'm a big boy, I can take it. So we're going to start with the battleground of history, all right? And if any of this text is too small, you can feel free to raise your hand and say, what does that say up there? And I'll be happy to read or gesticulate wildly or do whatever it is I need to do to get the information across. What I've also done up here is an interesting typographical choice that I think I only realized the implications of when I was walking over here this morning. What I've done on the slide is everything that appears in red is Putin's argument. I rubricated it. And as I was walking over here this morning, I thought to myself, what are people in this Presbyterian church going to think when they see text in red? They're going to think of the New Testament, right? I am so happy you're laughing at that because I was actually terrified for a moment that you would all think that I was trying to compare Putin with Jesus Christ, and I am not doing that. Saying that point blank, this is a typographical choice. It is nothing else, okay? But what I've done here is I've tried to outline Putin's historical revisionism for us. A lot of the language I have up on the PowerPoint I'm going to talk about today is language that's being used by pundits on the news media regularly, and so I want you to understand what it is that they're actually talking about. Historical revisionism means something wildly different for trained disciplinary historians like myself versus what it means in the political realm. Historical revisionism is a dirty word when it comes to politics. It means you have taken the past and you've altered the narrative in a way that asserts your position on some political aim, right? Everything in history is inherently political, is what I tell the students. And what we want to do is to try to strip that political nature back and try to get down to the nuts and bolts of the stuff, right? That helps us to be objective and then to return back to that narrative. So I'm going to go through some of the key hitting points of Putin's historical revisionism, of his politics of history, because right as Russian troops were crossing the border into the Ukraine, Putin publishes a history essay, right? You don't expect him to do something like this, but he publishes a history essay in which he denies Ukrainian history across the board. He calls it an aberration. It's a fabrication. It's a figment of a very small minority imagination who wanted to claim control over this part of what is supposed to be Russia in Putin's mind, okay? And for him, this story starts in 1917. For anybody who knows anything about the 20th century, 1917 is a pivotal year, right? World War I is a raging. The war has tipped the socioeconomic balance in Russia in ways that nobody was anticipating. And then we get the Bolshevik Revolution, right? And everything under the Russian Empire falls apart, fragmentation, contending parties trying to claim control. And for a brief second, we see the Ukrainian People's Republic formed in 1917. I say brief second, it's not actually a second. It's a very brief moment of time before it is reabsorbed then into the Soviet Union. Okay? Ukrainian freedom fighters is what I'm going to keep calling them here, but you could call them a variety of different things. Look at 1917 as their moment of independence, like our American Revolution or something, right? They have broken away from an imperial oppressor, and now is their moment to assert their own rights to self-determination. That's the language Woodrow Wilson uses in World War I, right? They have the right to control their own political destinies. But then they get absorbed right back into the Soviet Union. And so what does Putin say about all of this? That was an aberration. That was a blip. They were always supposed to be part of the Russian fold. They just got away like a lost puppy or something, and now they're back with us. We're all following this? But even to this day, those Ukrainian nationalists point to 1917. They say that was our moment of liberation, and we've been under the thumb of the Russians ever since. Okay? Where this gets even hairier is when we get through the Great Global Depression, right? It's not just an American phenomenon. It was far worse in Eastern Europe than it ever got here in the United States, and into World War II. Okay. As World War II breaks out and the Germans blitzkrieg their way into France and all of these things are going on, they turn their sights to Russia. And Russia is their biggest contender, and the Germans desperately need to divide Russian forces at the outset of World War II. So what do? They set their sights on the Ukraine and these freedom fighters, right? These people who want to contest Soviet control over the area. Is everybody following me on this? Okay. They do this by playing to the qualms, to the problems that the Ukrainian people are having in the 1930s and are having specifically with the Soviet Union. The two most important of these are the massive famine that happens in the 1930s, the Holodomor famine, which kills 3.9 million people in about 3.5 years' time. To give you a point of scale here, the Bengali famine of 1943 kills about 4 million people in 1 year versus 3 years. And what did the Bengali people do soon afterwards? If you were in my world history class, I'd go like this and you would all know the answer. They overthrew the yoke of the British Empire and declared themselves independent. There's something similar happening here. We just don't imagine it as such because this is Europe and we don't play by the same rules in Europe. In fact, they do. The other part of all of this is that during those early Soviet years, there's a very intense, a very intentional Russification campaign that occurs in the Ukraine. Russification means they're trying to convince these people that they are in fact Russian first, and Ukraine doesn't really mean anything to them. That's not a national identity they need to hold themselves to. We all following? The problem with Russification in the 1930s, and there are a lot of problems with it, is that it's targeted primarily at the Ukrainian elite. So the Soviet Union, the Kremlin, is dumping money into the Ukrainian elite. They're having a great time, while at the same time, what's happening to everybody else in the country? 3.9 million people are dying of starvation. You can't have that disparity of wealth at play in society and expect people not to push back. So when the Nazis are pushing against the Russians, they go to Ukraine and they find a natural ally. We know the Nazis for what the Nazis did. The Ukrainians saw the Nazis as a vehicle for liberation. Notice how complicated all of this is, right? Putin looks at the relationship between the Ukrainian freedom fighters with the Nazis and says that obliterates any positive claim you can ever make to a Ukrainian history. And you need a Ukrainian history to assert a Ukrainian nation. We all following? The problem, or the flip side, there are a lot of problems with all of this, is those Ukrainian nationalists still want to latch on to this moment in time. They rose up, they pushed back against the Soviets. Yes, they took a misstep by identifying or aligning with the Nazis, which is really bad. I can't underscore that enough, but they want to choose to focus on the positive elements for their own nation state formation. Putin's not letting any of that go. And we can all talk about whether or not we should let the Ukrainians let that go. I don't think we should. And the Ukrainians certainly have not done a very good job of making amends for their role in the Holocaust. All right? So what does Putin do? He says there is no Ukrainian nationalist history. Sees all of this as an invention by Western powers in the Ukraine to strip Russia of resources, of people, of all kinds of stuff. Ultimately, it's meant to hurt Russia. Okay? What does Western powers mean in World War II for the Soviet Union? It means Germany. What does Western powers mean for Putin now in the 21st century? Us. We all following? A fact that maybe some of you are aware of is that 1 in 4 Jewish individuals died during the Holocaust in the Ukraine. That is a fact that the Ukrainian government recognizes, that Russia is mobilizing to assert that Nazism formed the modern state that we recognize as Ukraine and still exists in its highest echelons. That's what Putin wants us to believe. The obvious counterfact to all of this is Zelensky is Jewish, but for Putin, Zelensky is nothing but a puppet for Westerners who are trying to tear down Russian glory, so on and so forth. And Putin's control over the state media and what would appear as independent to an untrained eye media in Russia are all telling the Russian people this exact same thing. This invasion of the Ukraine is a anti-Nazi movement, and that's really hard to argue against, right? If you think about it as a rhetorical strategy, it's pretty brilliant, even if Putin is a megalomaniac, maniacal individual. So I'll just give you one example of this, right? The Ukrainians have not done a very good job of making amends. And what you'll notice up on the right-hand side of the slide is a statue of Stepan Bandera, who was one of those Ukrainian freedom fighters from World War II. He was one of these individuals who pushed the hardest against the Soviet Union, but also chose to align with the Nazis. And if you go and you can read this text, which I cannot. Again, I'm more Western European than anything else. There is no mention in any of the placards in and around this area of his relationship with the Nazi regime, nor his role in helping to round up Jewish individuals to send them to their systematic execution. Aren't you all happy we ate before? Yeah. So this is the thing that I think is kind of interesting. As you can probably imagine, all across the world, historians are getting phone calls right now asking to provide exactly what I'm attempting to provide you all today. And the question that seems to be on most people's minds is, what is Putin actually trying to accomplish? What is he trying to rebuild? All right? And for the most part, there are two arguments that have come out of all of this. Either Putin is hoping to return to Soviet glory, or he's trying to do something else. For me, the Soviet glory argument, the reconstruction of the Soviet era, is driven more by our memories of the Cold War than by actual fact. All right? The rhetoric, the discourse, the ideologies of the Kremlin today look nothing like they did in the 20th century. There's no talk of collectivization. There's no Karl Marx being bandied around. There's nothing like that. And we know for a fact that Putin's authority is largely propped up on the wealthy 1%, that oligarchical faction in Russia today, which runs completely counterintuitive to the idea that we're going to see the rebirth of at least a capitalist, democratic first world and communist second world. I don't think that's what's happening here by any stretch of the imagination. The argument I find more convincing is the second one up here, which is that if Putin is truly enamored by history and truly wants to regenerate some past form of the Russian people or the Russian state, he's looking far more to the Russian Empire that predated the Bolshevik Revolution than anything else. The Russian Empire of the 19th century was the largest empire the world has ever seen, much larger than the British Empire, at least in terms of landmass. Right? It stretched down into the Ukrainian territories. It took all of those Istan countries across Eurasia. It was a force to be contended with. All right? And it fits in a lot of ways, at least broadly culturally speaking, with what Russian culture looked like in the 19th century, a focus on orthodoxy, right? There's no challenge here. Everybody is trying to merge into some homogenous oneness, autocracy. Putin enjoys incredible popular support. If you look at any of the reports that come out of the Kremlin or any of the so-called independent ones, he is always enjoying a 50, 60, 70, 80%, if not more sometimes, popular support percentage. How true is that? Who knows, all right? But in a world where open communication is actively policed, is being processed constantly by their police state, people aren't made aware of counterintuitive or oppositional positions in Russia like we might be able to here. That sophisticated police state is a big part of this. Nationalism also true. We're seeing a return of Russification. Right? This idea that all these people who might identify by different ethnicities should instead view themselves as being Russian first and foremost is at the heart of all of what we're seeing happening in the Ukraine. right? He's denying that Ukrainian identity exists, period, as a vehicle by which he can mobilize troops across their border. So that's our first factor, right? And it's a big one. And it's I think the thing that is driving his ideological support at home. So now we can keep moving to the present, and we can think in geopolitical terms. You all heard at the outset of all of this that I'm a historian of revolution and religion, and the Ukrainian revolution of 2014 is something that's of great interest to me, and also very important in this larger story. We probably don't think of 2014 as a revolutionary moment. We probably focus on 2014 as the moment that Russia annexed Crimea, right, as the first big salvo in this war that would come in 2022. And that's how the Ukrainian people see 2014. I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were doing all of these interviews with Ukrainian people about the fear of Russian troops mobilized on their border, and all of them said, that's nothing new. It's been that way since 2014. We've been neighbors with the Russians for so long. A lot of our family members are Russians. We know what's happening here. And so when they crossed the border, it wasn't the globally shocking moment that we imagined it was, at least not for them. Okay? So we see a revolution break out in 2014, largely driven by the president of the Ukraine at that time, Yanukovych, who, after a long debate about signing an agreement between the Ukraine and the EU for positive trading policies, decided to back out of it completely. The Ukrainian people for a while now have been lobbying to become a part of the European Union, have been lobbying to become part of NATO, and that scares Putin like we cannot imagine, right? Because doing that is rejecting everything that Russia has been trying to cultivate since World War II with these Russification programs. Right? So we see that happen. Yanukovych gets expelled from the presidency, and a new democratic election is called. And this all scares Putin because Yanukovych was his one big supporter on this bordering state. So what happens? Putin is called in the middle of the night to have an emergency meeting. What are we going to do about Ukraine? What are we going to do about this president? Are we going to pull him out of the country? What are we going to do? And it's in that meeting, as the transcripts show, that he starts talking about the Crimea in really serious ways. And shortly afterwards, they mobilize troops and they take the Crimea. Does everybody know where the Crimea is located? You're doing the thing my students do, where they nod their heads yes, but I'm looking at the confidence levels, and I'm a little concerned. We all know where the Crimea is located, though, now, okay? The Crimea has been a prize for the Russian Empire for a very long time. Way back when in the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century, this was the space that Russia was betting on for its future economic viability. What do we know about Russia? It's big, it's cold. Yes? And it doesn't have a whole lot of inlets to oceanic trade, which is what's making global empires in the 19th century. So Crimea is the meal ticket for the Russian Empire to have some say over maritime spaces. What maritime spaces? The Black Sea puts them in conversation with our Baltic states, many of whom have Slavic peoples, and then the Ottoman Empire turned Turkey. So of great strategic importance. What other ports of call does the Russian Empire have? They've got really cold ones in the Arctic Circle, only one of which opens up for them each year. And then they have some Eastern Baltic ones around St. Petersburg, but they're not all that useful, right? This provides them with an incredible economic boon in 2014, plain and simple. He seizes Crimea in 2014, and this provides him with a lot of trade and naval benefits. And we've seen those naval benefits coming into play here in the last 3 weeks, right, as Russian ships are moving their way, especially around Mariupol over to Odessa. So that's the first step in all of this, right? Why does he stop in 2014 just to bring this all back in 2022? I have my thoughts that very much lean on global geopolitics and especially the fate of our American election, but there's no way of saying exactly why Putin decided to stop. It might be that he was just trying to figure out how to control Crimea better. It might be as simple as something like that, but I doubt it. So what ends up happening, we get our invasion of Ukraine here on February 24th in 2022, and all of this really seems to be coming to the head. Why geopolitically 2022? Zelensky has been asking for admission into NATO and reinvigorating these conversations about the independent countries coalition in the European Union alongside the European Union, as well as applying to become a part of the European Union. And if you look at our two respective maps, the one at the top is the post-NATO, post-Warsaw Pact division of Europe, right? NATO is our North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's all our blue states over there. All of the red ones on the right-hand side of that top map, right? That's the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Those are all the countries that decided to align during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We go to the map on the bottom, and all of the blue countries are NATO members as of January 2022, and you can almost see them kind of encroaching their way westward. Again, this is the thing that threatens that Russification campaign, the efforts of Putin and others to make Russia a superpower like they were during the Cold War anew in the 21st century. And the two buffer states in all of this would be Belarus and Ukraine. Belarus still has a government which is very much indebted to Russia. They're not doing anything. In fact, we have a person in our counseling department who is from Belarus, whose father had to sell his cabin in the woods to finance his journey out of Belarus. And apparently at some point somebody held a gun to his head. I don't know exactly what happened there, but the situation in Belarus is frightening, not as frightening as what's happening in the Ukraine. The Ukraine to the south is that other buffer state. But imagine Ukraine up there flipped blue, and had I done my due diligence, I could have hit a button and maybe it would have flipped blue for our enjoyment here. All of a sudden, those NATO states are really right up on Russia, especially if you take Turkey to the south. And then Georgia is no friend of the Russians these days either. Okay? So Zelensky is this kind of great white hope in many ways for this Ukrainian independence movement, and also joining in geopolitically with the so-called West that Putin fears so much and rhetorically demonizes so often. So now let's talk about economic concerns. I know you're all excited to learn about the economic history of Russia. It's probably not something that you stay up late at night thinking about, but it's gone through some pretty dramatic changes over the last several decades. How could the collapse of the Soviet Union lead to anything else, right? In the 1980s, we're going to start to see a kind of slow deterioration of the Soviet Union's economic bloc. That collectivization that Stalin had really pushed through earlier on in the 20th century is starting to wear and tear, and historians often debate where that wear and tear is often coming from. Is it the workers in Gdansk and other places that are starting to challenge the status quo? Maybe. Is it the would-be rich elite in Russia who can't be recognized as rich elite individuals who are slowly tearing away at the economic policies of the Kremlin? Maybe so. Is it likely both? Yes, it's probably likely both. But likely what you've been hearing a lot of in the news is talk of these oligarchs. This is the language that the Russians use to refer to the incredibly rich capitalist individuals in Russia who, especially in the collapse of the Soviet Union, took advantage of the crisis to seize up government resources, to orchestrate, to organize for themselves. And I did what I tell my students not to do. I pulled that image off of Wikipedia up there because there are a lot of oligarchs and almost all of them really prize their secrecy, okay? That's intentional. It's very Russian in the wake of the decline and fall of communism as well, not to want to celebrate one's own wealth for fear that communism comes back in the future and you become an instant target and end up just like all the other oligarchs in 1917, right? They have a long historical memory. But we have lots of new evidence to suggest that these oligarchs were responsible for a lot of the decline and fall, the corruption scandals of the 1980s. We know the first computers were brought into Russia by some of these oligarchical individuals, and then they start pushing. So Gorbachev then ends up giving us glasnost and perestroika, the two classic Russian words of the Cold War era. Glasnost meant increased transparency. People were tired of how corrupt and opaque the government was. And then perestroika meant a restructuring or a gradual market liberalization, is the fancy academic term for this. It means opening up to the capitalist West, right? My favorite example of this was apparently Coca-Cola would put their billboards along the Iron Curtain where only people in the Eastern Bloc could see it, but they weren't yet able to purchase those things, which is just such a nasty move, but also go Coca-Cola, I suppose, right? These oligarchs are going to buy up almost everything, and the things that they buy up are big money makers, and they also help us to understand why Ukraine would be so valuable for them, right? What kinds of things do they buy up? They buy up banking, oil, mining, transportation, and farming sectors, all of which the Ukraine has some very important vested interests in, all right? Some of which we'll see on this slide. So that's the collapse and fall of the Soviet Union done in a PowerPoint slide, which would make my colleagues who actually focus on this subject very uncomfortable, but we're going to keep moving forward for a nice narrative here. Now we look at the last decade of the Russian economy, and what we realize is that it has been floundering badly, much like many economies around the world, especially after the 2008 housing crisis and so on and so forth. Around 2012, 13, and 14, we're going to start to see rapid 10% nearly inflation in the ruble. It's doing a little bit better than it was in 2012, but also lots of other protests breaking out. A lot of different things are happening in Russia in 2012 to 14 that will help us to understand why Putin would decide to take the Crimea and bolster the economy through expansionism. Right? So the same thing then matters in 2020. What do we know happened in 2020? All together now? That's a weird thing to ask you to chant. The pandemic hit and hit everybody. And you can get a good, clean sense of this from a GDP chart of the Russian economy. We all remember February and March of 2020. Like it was yesterday, yeah? And that's where that massive dip in the purple comes from over there on the right-hand side. It's affecting everybody. It's affecting Russia, even if they don't want to admit it, at least not openly. But that's key. And my guess is probably what started happening was once they put out their vaccine really early, maybe you all remember that we were waiting for tests to go through and Putin was celebrating a pre-approved vaccine for all the Russian people. And I don't even remember what the date was exactly, but it was much earlier than for us. The last time I was ever jealous of Russian people, maybe. This is probably when a conversation about the Ukraine really commenced. It's around that time that we're seeing renewed interest in Ukrainian politics for joining the EU and joining NATO. They're trying to rebound their economies in much the same way by seeking some kind of new relationship with the West and so on and so forth. So probably what happened was COVID really drove them over the edge and necessitated dramatic intervention, which then led Putin to decide to deploy military to the border and then eventually to cross it. The next thing we need to understand is that engaging in warfare for the first year is almost universally profitable. For Putin, for people like you and I, and for those oligarchical figures, right? All of a sudden, there aren't jobs. They go to war. There are jobs for my students, right, to go off to war. That gets them a paycheck. That gets cut to their families. People look kindly on the government. Right? We all remember when we went to Iraq, maybe. Same kind of thing happened with our American economy at that point in time. And so what happens next is now you need to outfit that military. What do you need to outfit a military? You need guns. You need boots. Yeah. You need food supplies, supply lines. You need communication technologies. You need anything and everything, and guess who controls all of that in Mother Russia? The oligarchs, right? So how do they rebound an economy that's been stagnating, if not failing, across the 2010s? War is a way for them to recoup their losses pretty quickly. Okay. So what does Ukraine give us? Why Ukraine? Why not Belarus? Why not some other place? Why not Georgia? That could have happened too. The big one that the news media is pointing to is the oil and gas lines that are moving across the Ukraine. This is a map of said gas lines and oil pipelines that crisscross from Russia to the rest of Europe here, okay? The red are our oil pipelines and the green are our gas pipelines. Hopefully everybody can locate the Black Sea there in the bottom, right? And so just above the Black Sea, you see some pretty critical green and red lines moving through those areas. These are places that Zelensky is openly talking about, openly politicking around. A lot of these pipelines aren't actually operational yet, but he's threatening to cease operation once they start, or to stop the remainder of the construction, or to do all of these things, and that's putting a stranglehold on the growth of the Russian economy. And do we think Putin likes that? No. Okay? Putin does not like that. And so hitting Ukraine, invading Ukraine, offers the owners of those supply lines a chance to safeguard their interests. Who did we learn took hold of all of the oil after 1991? The oligarchs are back, right? Okay. Ukrainian food supplies. Ukraine is the second largest grain producer in Europe, actually. This is really important. Grain, wheat. My students are freaking out about gas prices. I wonder if some of you are as well as we head over $4. I'm more concerned about foodstuffs actually than I am gas prices. I think that's what's we won't feel it as much, but some places, Egypt in particular, is going to be devastated by grain disruptions here, because the number one consumer of Russian and Ukrainian grain in the world is Egypt. And what's going to happen? What grain the U.S. wants to get, we'll purchase because we have that power, and the Egyptians won't have that access. So I worry about late summer in particular for the Egyptians. Food supplies is a big one. Power plants is another one. There are a lot of mines in the Ukraine that produce all kinds of nasty things that make us think about the Cold War. I don't think that that's really what Putin's after. I think he's really trying to secure these gas and oil lines. So now I'm going to do what I said earlier on. It makes historians uncomfortable, and then we can have an open conversation. I'm going to try to make some predictions. One of the famous quips for historians is, if it happened during your lifetime, it's not history, it's journalism. And I'm an 18th centuryist, right? So like that kind of rings true for me a little bit. But what I tried to do here is make three basic predictions. Again, keeping in mind my background, my focus on revolution and religion, all of these kinds of things. I think economic sanctions are going to work. That's the biggest glimmer of hope I can give you all today, because one of the strongest arguments about the fall of the Soviet Union has to do with American spending, American banking, and the ability of American and Western banks to sanction Soviet wealth. All right? A lot of people were going poorer, they were suffering, they saw the West as a glimmering golden coin, a way towards prosperity and the growth of the middle class. And that's one of these arguments I think is really powerful and makes a lot of sense. How long? I have no clue. 45 days sounds nice, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're with this for the rest of the year and into next. And in the process of all of this, Ukraine is going to continue to suffer. These Ukrainians are going to continue to suffer. Global market chains are obviously going to be affected. I think gas and grain in particular are going to be the most important of these questions. They're already starting to see fluctuations in the grain economy now. If anybody likes to play the stock market, go buy a bunch of grain stock today. Do you think I have a lot of money to buy in the stock market? I'm a teacher, so no. But I think grain is probably where that's going to be going. It's going to affect those poorer countries. Egypt, again, I worry about greatly. And I also worry about poorer communities here in the United States who can't afford that uptick in gas price or $1 or $2 more for a loaf of bread. Again, it's not going to affect us. It's going to affect those people who are already on life's margins. And then the other part of this, and maybe it's the most philosophical of all of it, again, because I'm a historian of revolution, these Eastern European countries are very much concerned that what's happening now is going to spark further revolutionary violence, right? That revolution that happened in 2014 was pretty peaceful, that it could turn ugly pretty quickly, especially as they're being armed by their government. That the protests that we're catching glimpses of in Russia could potentially make their way through the safety net of the police state and then turn violent is a possibility. But if you're a government, how do you avoid violent upheaval? You have to provide them something to distract them, to fill their bellies, to make them not fear the absolute worst. So that's why I've got this last little bullet point. How we maintain our middle class and provide for the poor will be critical for maintaining any kind of stable system. Imagine what this is going to look like in a post-invasion Ukraine. The oligarchs there are going to have come out wealthier than before, and the poor people, like that woman passing in front of the apartment complex, she's going to be the one that's suffering. She'll be the one who maybe decides to enter the streets and be a revolutionary. Although she didn't really strike me too much as a revolutionary character, but you don't know what's in that bag. She could have some pretty crazy stuff in there for all we know. That's my 2 cents. That's how I'm processing this moment. That's how I see all of this coming to our present moment. But again, as I said at the beginning, I hope that you all have thoughts or things that you'd like to add to the conversation so that we might grow and learn in communion with each other.
I'm going to take the mic so their questions can be heard. So, questions?
Looking at the oil and gas pipeline situation, and also I was listening to something the other day that was talking about the miscalculations that Putin may have made in his being so isolated during COVID, that one of the things he miscalculated for sure was how Ukrainian people were going to respond.
Sure.
But also that he may have suffered from the misunderstanding and looking at Europe and some of the infighting in Europe and speculating that NATO was sort of at war with itself, the NATO countries. And then I read an article in the Times last week about Schultz in Germany and how he sort of flipped the switch a little bit and shut off the Nord Stream, and that will not happen in the future. And that his ability to sort of turn that around, in a way, does that signal a kind of shoring up of NATO? And what does that mean as it goes forward? Even though Ukraine will not become a part of NATO, apparently.
Not in the immediate, at least.
Right.
That seems to be a sticking point, and Zelensky's even said that he's open to backing off of joining NATO if it means resolving some tensions. With
the shutting off of Nord Stream and saying that's not going to happen in the future, how does that sort of strengthen Putin's resolve to take Ukraine and have access to pipelines that way? Because Europe is so dependent on Russian energy.
Yeah. That's a great question, and the response is hindsight's 20/20. So I think we'll only really know in a year or 2 or 5 years' time. What I saw this morning is that the ruble is heading in a positive direction, at least as it compares to the American dollar, and that was explained by this economist as a byproduct of gas sales increasing. The price point that it's rising to, people are still buying it, and he's benefiting from it back in Moscow. So I don't know. I mean, there are so many pipelines. If we go back to that map, there are a lot of different ways of cutting this global supply chain. The fragmentary nature of NATO, I actually think that what's happening in Ukraine is causing them to come together more or less, although there are partners that seem to be not as enthusiastic as others, Hungary being a big one, apparently. There was some opposition coming out of Hungary for rolling back some of the financial measures being taken to choke off financial stuff to those oligarchs and to Russia. I don't know. I don't know. I imagine only Putin really understands what's happening at these highest echelons. And my guess is every week he's readjusting his plan.
Do you think the isolation of COVID has sort of contributed to this?
Yeah.
That he's been so isolated, and I've heard some people
level.
and I've heard some people, thinking or implying that has allowed him to sort of double down on that,
Sure.
on his version of history.
Yes.
And that Russian-centric idea of history. And
yeah. I think we've all gone a little kooky while in isolation, yeah. We tend to buy into our own self-images. And it's quite possible that during COVID, he was only ever around people who were backing his plans for fear of their own safety or well-being. I don't know. There is a psychologist at Brown University who says that he calls it an autocratic tendency, or I think he uses like malaise or some kind of word that makes it sound much more negative. That looked at a number of different kind of totalitarian figures across human history, tried to track their changes over their time in power. And in these moments of extreme crisis, people tend to double down in those positions because it was their leadership that brought the good times before. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he is incredibly deluded. I mean, I don't want to say that he is because I'm not a psychologist, but I do know that a lot of the reports coming from the intelligence agencies in Russia indicate that they were not aware of the movement across the Ukrainian border like we would expect them to be, that a lot of this was played much closer to the chest, which I think would suggest some kind of autocratic tendency or paranoia, maybe. And I don't know. I'm just going to keep saying that too, because I think that's the only defensible position in a lot of this.
Okay, yep, another question here.
My question is a two-parter. The first thing is we get so much information, it makes your head swim, doesn't it, sometimes? So the first question is about Belarus. I thought that in the beginning I had heard that the military and whatever equipment Belarus has and whatever, it was firmly, so that would be a push south into Ukraine, that they were going to help. And then I thought I heard that they weren't. I figure you can answer that.
My response to that is the geography of that part of Ukraine is much more difficult to traverse. There's a reason why he's coming up from the Black Sea and then coming from the east, is because those are much easier lands to cross with built-up interstate systems and all of this kind of stuff. The reason why all of these refugees are dipping out to the southwest into Poland through Lviv is because that's the most efficient pathway. That land is they could do it if they were forced to do it. More than anything else, at least again from my talks with my colleague, is that there's a very real fear of conscription that's about to happen in Belarus, and they'll be brought through Russia and probably around that eastern flank rather than forced through the northwestern corridors that exist. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
That was part one. And also, kudos to you, because it's like you've been to an academic conference. Every historian goes, I have a 16-part question. And I didn't bring a piece of paper to take notes down. So.
No, I have a kind of vested interest. My second cousin married a Ukrainian. They live in North Carolina. And another cousin and I We went over to visit. We were there for a month and a half, for goodness sakes. We went to many of these places. Yeah, Lviv, where all these refugees are going.
Yeah.
It's tearing me apart. And this particular family, the family of my cousin who got married into our family, they just got out, except for the husband, who is a male and of certain age.
Yeah.
So my second question is about, I don't even know how to pronounce it, or identify it. Those two, I would call them counties or whatever, those two sections in Ukraine that are, let's see, southeast kind of.
I don't think
and
I
they
have a
keep
close-up
calling
now.
them, these are Russians and these are Russian speakers.
In the eastern part. That's
Yeah.
what you're talking about?
Kind of southeast. That
Luhansk and
Donetsk,
Dusk.
the red part.
Yeah, and Kharkiv to some extent too.
What's happening there? What is going to happen there?
Yeah, there's factionalism across Ukraine. There's not a single Ukrainian ethnicity in this entire lot too, which is another kind of fiction, right? Ukrainianism is more a nationality than it is an ethnicity, and then there are local, regional kind of subsects of all of that. And the groups that are along that strong Kharkiv, especially down along the side, all the way down to Crimea, those are areas that are far more dependent on Russian economy than the other side of the deep river, Kiev, and then over to the west, which will benefit more from an EU alliance, right? And so one possible outcome people are imagining is along the river down to the Black Sea, a kind of break separation and then a two Ukrainian state or something, where the east is more aligned with Russia and the west is more aligned with the West, I suppose. Again, we have no idea what exactly this is going to look like in the end. A lot of people think Putin is overstating his support in those eastern territories. I don't know what metric they're using to make those claims, though, right? It might be that they just want to imagine that he is a completely fictional individual, right? That he just invents out of thin air threats, then responds to those threats as a way to assert his power even more. That's the big, conspiracy with his rise to power in 1999, that the bombings throughout Russia that he took advantage of to ascend to the presidency were actually orchestrated by himself. Russians don't think about that. That same NPR thing I listened to, they interviewed Russians. They were like, do you think he seized the presidency through illegal means? And most of them either said no, or it does not matter because he's our president now. Which is a terrifying thought.
One or two more.
Or we go all night.
Settle in, friends.
Do you see that, or does it appear, we were talking about this the other night with my parents, that he's got his eyes set on the Baltic States, that Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia?
I don't think so.
Okay, because I've heard a little rumbling of that just in, maybe because they all asserted their nationhood in 1919, is that?
Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all fall within those NATO states, though. Okay. I think Putin is happy to say, I have nuclear warheads and I will use them. This is mutually assured destruction discourse straight out of the Cold War. Nobody's going to use it, because if he does use it, what's going to happen to Putin?
Right.
I mean, he knows that just as well as anybody else. This is a game of, chicken. We've all played chicken at some point. I played it last week with my 4-year-old. I lost. I think he. Yeah.
First of all, anybody want to buy a Dodge truck with a Hemi, because it's $110 to fill it up with gas, but always spinning things positive. Last Monday or Tuesday in the Wall Street Journal, there was a graph, and it showed the increase in prices in things like flour and wheat and gasoline, milk. Here, Italy, France, a bunch of the European countries and other places around the world. So if you can go online and find that, and I'm not sure which day it was, it's really interesting. Most of my family's in France, and they're suffering double what we are already. So say your prayers and be thankful. And my question to you is, how much more is it going to go up? Do we know?
Okay.
Can we guess?
Yeah.
Is it going to
God
double?
asked me to do that. What I'll say is that the price we're seeing right now, and if you take into account inflation, is still lower than it was 10 years ago. When we were going into Afghanistan, well, I guess it was more than 10 years ago now. But if you take into account inflation, we would be sitting at like $5.30, I think is what I saw. And we're not at $5.30 yet.
Well, they're almost $7 in California.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a lot.
yeah. Do we want one more question?
It's not a question, it's just a short observation.
Yeah.
When you were talking a few minutes ago about the Ukrainian being a nation, not an ethnicity,
Yeah.
and the divisions within the country
Yeah.
that make it vulnerable, really. And I'm thinking about when I went to school, we learned that the strength of the United States of America was because we were a melting pot.
Yes.
And those become ugly words. Nobody.
Melting pot? Salad bowl is the food reference people use in higher education.
As a salad as strong as, I don't know, I just wondered, in terms of thinking of how that relates to our own situation.
Yeah.
I don't know,
In the 20th century, it was very common to define nation states in ethnic terms. It's not so much anymore because we've become so cosmopolitan, indebted to a global system. But as we're seeing here, I mean, we are still seeing the reoccurrence of ethnic-inspired nationalist rhetoric.
who's it, Black, whatever came out and said that this war is the end of globalization?
Who said this?
Who's the asset management, something, whose father's here? It's the largest in the world. Black, it's the largest asset management company in the world.
Globalization has been going on for 2,000 years. I don't think this is stopping it. But that's my 2 cents.
All right, let's thank Dr. Banks for being with us. Well done. Thank you so much. This will be available for you to watch again or share with your friends, your family, and others. Thank you all for coming. God bless you, and we'll see you again. Thank you, Dr. Banks. Well done.
Happy to be the inaugural one.
The first.